Hello.
Hello. That was a fast transition.
Is this all of us, do you think?
I think Jasmine's just stepped out for a second, but she'll be, but yeah.
All right.
There she is.
I just hit the record button, which the team asked me to do. So my role's done. I think I'm here to listen. I hit the record button. I did it.
I can speak up a little bit. This is Jennifer with Energy Outreach Colorado. So we actually administer all of the low-income efficiency programs for the state through the investor-owned utilities. So we have funds, and we really grew our programs dramatically after ARA. And I absolutely agree with you, Jeremy, that it has to be jobs and not job training, because the biggest issue we have now is we have no capacity to scale the work that we're doing. We've invested a lot of money in Denver. Denver, actually, part of that franchise fee that was renegotiated several years ago, there's $2 million set aside for energy efficiency, both in single family homes, multifamily properties. There's a lot of really good programs there. There's a lot of really good organizations doing this work in communities now. Groundwork Denver, Mile High Youth Corps, Dura. We have a really strong kind of basis to grow this. And I'm really excited about your comments, because I think, again, we have a really good, strong existing infrastructure that Liz is very aware of, that I think we can build on, at least from that equity, efficiency, jobs. And I think the biggest issue we're going to need is that workforce development, just getting those contractors to start hiring people, to have long-term funding contracts, because we cannot operate on these year-to-year, because that's where that capacity keeps dropping. And this work is getting into homes. It's doing insulation and air sealing and replacing carpet and giving people HEPA vacuums and, looking at ventilation because of moisture issues. I mean, this is hard work, and it has not been done coordinated. Energy efficiency programs and rehab programs have not typically worked together because the funding sources are different. It's really hard to tell people they have to change their behavior in homes, which is what we need. If kids have asthma, then you can't have parents smoking and multiple dogs and, not using that ventilation. So this is complicated. And I think, but again, we have a really good infrastructure to start some of this work. So I just want to put the plug in for that, because, I think we've been building this over the last 10 years, and now what we need is help to scale. We need warranty of habitability so that landlords are required to participate in this for their tenants, because those are the folks that are not benefiting from, the market driving this. So that's my quick overview on that.
Thanks for sharing that, Jennifer. Is there like I was looking at these questions they want us to address in the chat that are about like criteria that should guide climate investments. I mean, you've got a nice sort of pitch for a specific program. Is there also a criteria that comes out of that that could help the task force think overall about what kind of recommendations to put forward in the age of, recovery and COVID?
Well, I think what would be great coming out of the task force is what targeted communities does Denver need to focus on, because it tends to be, we did a lot of work in Elyria, Swansea. We managed that project, taking those CDOT funds, layering them with Denver funds and Excel funds to do a full mitigation. We did 300 homes in a year. It was phenomenal. If we're going to do that, scaling, we need to prioritize certain neighborhoods, because this sort of like, let's serve everybody all the time just doesn't work. What really, really worked was very concentrated neighborhood approach. We were able to serve everyone because of just the district, and we didn't have to do individual income qualification. People didn't need to be fearful of citizenship requirements. There's so much paperwork and oversight in these programs serving vulnerable households, because you have to prove how poor everybody is and that they're consistently poor, that it makes it, those barriers are absolutely there. We had some homeowners and some renters, and so that renter piece needs to have some rules around, what they're required to do. I mean, I think from my perspective, the criteria needs to be that if we need to identify which neighborhoods are prioritized and start working through them. And then, I think the minority and women-owned businesses is absolutely a priority, and that can be ramped up for sure. I think, it's going to be around that permitting issue. One of the things that really, in that Alaria Swansea example, was that when we ran into a situation where we had to red tag a furnace, we were able to solve the problem immediately without having to force that family out. I mean, we had some hotel options for short-term things, but we need to kind of understand that if we're going to go in these homes and improve the health and the energy affordability, there needs to be some understanding of what that means of disrupting homes. I mean, it took multiple visits to get into people's homes. So that's the single family side. And then there's the larger sort of multifamily, which has its own, or, small commercial, which has its own issues. But I think, those criteria around some of that have already been established, and we just need to enforce them and balance all the different offices that come together on this. I'll just throw out there again, Denver has a lot of money coming in for new affordable housing, and there hasn't been a climate sort of lens on that, as far as I can tell, in terms of requiring that it's all electric or that it's net zero or some of those kinds of things. So I think that's another opportunity.
I think it's worth bringing up now when we're talking about what communities and what aspects of the economy have been hit the hardest. I think it's pretty clear that hospitality, restaurants, hotels, are on the forefront of that. And so trying to think about, rather than geographic communities, the communities around that segment of our economy, and a lot of those people are living paycheck to paycheck. I think that's a pretty regular situation within that industry. And so, they're not only have gotten the most layoffs and have been hit the hardest from the economic standpoint, but they're also probably the most at risk because of the fact that they don't have savings, they don't have the ability to weather the storm. And so when we're talking about identifying groups, I think that's a segment we need to really focus on and try to think about. And I think it's tied to question 2 about what should we focus on. My feeling is that there's going to be a lot of political support for doing things that are going to jumpstart the economy. And so if we can do things that provide direct jobs, like Jeremy, what you were saying, but focused on those areas where people have gotten hit the hardest. So is there ways that we can create jobs that work towards our goals from a climate standpoint, but that could really be focused on the hospitality industry as a source of labor?
I would agree with you, John. One other area, a couple of other areas I would add that have been hard hit as well. I know a lot of our shopping center owner members are hard hit because their small businesses in those shopping centers have been so badly hit. I have spoken to one of my shopping center owners, and for April, they collected 17% of their rent, but they still have all of their expenses, their mortgage, they have to keep the lights on and all of that stuff. So when we're thinking about impacted communities, I think we need to also be thinking about a broader base of that, because it's even some of our high-rise office owners, while by and large they collected most of what they expected to in rents in April, they're not expecting that to be the case in May or June. And they do, while it may have taken us 30 to 45 days to get where we are now, the anticipation is, from the surveys we've done across the country, it's going to take significantly longer than that to rebound. While it was a straight shot down, they're not expecting a straight shot back up. It's going to take a long time, particularly for small businesses. And I own a small business, so I understand how impactful this has been. And I think, on talking about criteria, for me, I think we have to consider, one of our criteria is not adding any more emotional strain to people who are just trying to figure out how to keep their offices and businesses running. I'm trying to figure out how I can keep 6 people employed. And so we really need to be sensitive to that.
Well, and to your point, I think there's going to be, we don't really know the extent. So when we talk about the industries or the communities most affected, there will be the lingering effect, right? I mean, once property owners have to start laying off staff, and then banking industry gets hit. And so there's sort of this like, avalanche of potential industries that are also impacted. And so thinking down the road about what's coming versus what's already happened. I keep thinking about, and Jeremy, you're sort of touched on this, but thinking about all of the downturns that we've faced as a country. And one of the most effective tools has been when the government puts people to work, whether it's capital projects, rebuilding roads, whatever that might be. And to me, we've got such an opportunity right now to make sure that that kind of stimulus, that kind of effort is put towards our energy infrastructure and put towards, sort of what Jennifer was saying about going in and renovating buildings or renovating homes to, with the angle of trying to make them more energy efficient, but making sure that as we talk about these different stimulus packages, that they're focused on jobs, but also focused on jobs that are working towards the end of trying to mitigate climate change.
I think you've got a huge opportunity there, and especially to the extent that you're also layering in the health aspects, because our crisis is, a public health crisis, an economic crisis, and a climate crisis. And so the extent that you all can be the ones that are pointing out how limited public dollars can really be put to use addressing all of those, I think you're going to have some gravity towards your ideas. And I think the conversation today sort of starting to think about what are the criteria and what are some of the programs we might put forward. I really agree. I think you've got a real opportunity there. It'd be a shame if all the infrastructure.
Sorry. There's a lot of things that that we could spend money on as a government that are not going to paying people. Like if you redo a road, there's a lot of materials and machinery and different things that cost a lot. And so I'm wondering if we can focus on, of all the ideas we've talked about as a group, what are the ones that are less expensive from a physical cost of materials and stuff, and more focused on manpower? What could we focus on that really puts the most people to work?
I think some of the things Jennifer mentioned about green jobs may fall into that category, John.
Great.
And I'd like to just say too that we really need that money to not stay in government for more government jobs. They need to go to local businesses to build their capacity, because that is exactly what happened. And that's the tendency when these stimulus dollars come in, is just to continue to build. And it's like, I'm a contractor for the city of Denver. The amount of work that we do to just get paid is ridiculous. I mean, I think there's so many things that we need to force moving forward, that the normal that we have now does not need to exist, and that the due diligence has to still be there. But we have got to get the money into local businesses so that they can grow over time and that they can continue to build this business around it. So it's like the first infusion of dollars. So from a criteria perspective, I think that just needs to be highlighted, because in Denver is famous for this. They love creating offices. They love creating lots of new opportunities, to talk about this stuff, but the money needs to get back out into local places, because the nonprofits that are serving this field right now are really, really hurting. Donations are down, and they need these contracts to be maintained to keep this work going. And they're really good at serving vulnerable households. That's the other dynamic, is that this is not an easy population always to serve, because they're in crisis. So you have to balance the idea of the long-term green, benefits of this with the immediate crisis that families are dealing with. And small businesses, I think that was a really good point, Kathy.
We always talk about creating circular economies. I'm in the waste industry, and recycling in general creates 9 times more jobs than landfilling. And we're always talking about how we need a local hub in Colorado, since Colorado has been called a desert. It takes a lot of money to transport heavy materials, especially. So John, going back to your point around roads, Fort Collins already has a machinery that takes in asphalt and concrete and grinds it up and reuses for other projects. So why can't we have that too? We already have glass as a closed loop in Colorado, but there are other things that we can build upon as well, other materials.
Yeah. You know, we had talked about in the buildings subgroup this idea of trying to create some sort of funding mechanism to help people finance energy retrofits of their homes and buildings. You know, to your point, Jennifer, about getting the people, or Kathy, to getting the money to small businesses, you know, the city could put together a funding mechanism or a financing mechanism, and then really look to the private businesses to go out and to help people find ways to retrofit their buildings, use that financing tool to pay for it, but you're putting people to work not only in assessing buildings, but also in physically making the renovations. So if there's a grant available that lets people, you know, put solar panels on the roof, well, then you're putting people to work to actually install those and to build.
And John, that exists now through the Colorado Energy Office. There's partnerships with different credit unions, and then there's also the PACE financing, which building owners can use, which is the Property Assessed Clean Energy. And Colorado just opened up its first green bank through the Colorado Clean Energy Fund, which is exactly taking that capital and redeploying it out. So I think that's exactly, those could be all nodded to use those. And then one idea that I just want to throw out is on-bill financing with Denver Water. It's going to be really hard to do it with Xcel because they don't want to be a bank. But as a municipal water district, you could finance energy efficiency and water savings on your water bill. I mean, that's what Fort Collins is doing, and I think that's a really great suggestion.
Yeah, and to the point about PACE, really quickly, if we can make sure that we can expand the availability of that, I think that would help, because I think there's a lot of benefit and a lot of our members have started to use it. But it's not that there's unlimited dollars for anybody who wants to use it. So if we can expand that to where it's available for everybody, I think that would be hugely beneficial.
I agree. I think that availability is really huge.
Yeah. And then maybe there may be some additional work to make sure that the opportunities that are generated through that financing get to the folks who really need them the most, right? And sort of think about where those dollars flow, and whether that's minority women business contracting or targeted hire programs or other ways that we can help people out. Do other people see this thing that says we're going back? And
yeah, we're going back. Really quick though, families that are vulnerable do not loans do not work. I mean, that's one of the problems with Dura. They need to be grants, not loans, and
that's right.
They need to be paid up front, not as tax credit.
Well, hello, all y'all.
It's been a long time, everybody.
You spent so much time together. I feel like you're my new virtual friends.
Right. Too early for happy hour, unfortunately.
Hey, it's 5 o'clock somewhere.
That's true.
I have to admit, I'm normally just only a social drinker, but with all these virtual happy hours, I have been finding and drinking a lot more during this.
Well, Stephen, it doesn't look like you have to go very far for your booze.
Yeah, just find it.
Okay, I feel like I need to look at a list of the actual solutions so that we can figure out what to prioritize them given the current situation for economic recovery. Is this
Do we have
let me see. Is this the Trello board that they were talking about?
Yes.
For buildings and
so
homes,
where are the
right?
buildings? Yeah.
Okay. Let me see if I pull it up and then I'll share that. All right. I hope this is the right one.
That's it.
Cool. Okay.
So we have to prioritize which solution and anything that isn't on there.
Yeah, up to 5, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So we have new construction, existing construction, marketing outreach, incentives, financing, training, education. And
Can I make a suggestion that might narrow this down a little bit? I think we should focus on existing buildings right now because it's the fastest, and there's going to be a lot of challenges with breaking ground on new buildings over the next 12 to 18 months. So I think doing things on existing buildings can probably get people to work right away.
Mm-hmm.
I might have a different take on that. I think that as we're talking about stimulus money and new investments, I'd love to see the city stay on track with talking about new construction, especially like that also might be a solution for getting more people to work. Like if we're talking about new construction and the way that we're building new buildings. Maybe we come up with one top priority for existing, one for new. Yeah.
I think my concern with the new is that it takes so much time to get financing in place, to get the architecture and design and permitting and all that, those steps, that the impact of getting people to work will be a year or two out. So I guess like my thinking was, what's the first thing to try to get people jobs as quickly as possible that work towards the ends of climate change. So new buildings, I think it's important. I think it's critical. I just think it will not necessarily impact new job creation as quickly as existing buildings.
Mm.
Well, and is the code work going to happen regardless? I mean, I think these are going to be suggestions that can happen, and then they'll, come into play.
Well, I think new buildings are critical. I mean, that's all really, really critical work, and I don't want to pretend like it's not. I just think that, in my mind, I was thinking that the most important thing we could do is things that would get people jobs as quickly as possible. And it just feels like that existing, I mean, you could do things that could get people working within a couple months on existing buildings versus a year or two out.
Well, and
although I think, go ahead, Jennifer.
I was just going to say the challenge is how social distancing plays out in those existing buildings, because a lot of the work, if it's like in unit, is different than sort of the bigger structural piece. Like we're doing a ton of lighting and HVAC right now because buildings are vacant. And so I think that's an interesting, we've been able to keep those contractors going. And I think when you look at what is that efficiency work, I mean, I think there's absolutely ways to do that. But then it's also just the capacity of those contractors. So if the contractors aren't doing new building work, then those folks can be redeployed into existing buildings. And then it's kind of prioritizing again in those neighborhoods that are going to have the most benefit from the health and economics of it. I mean, right now we're not seeing a huge demand in energy assistance because there's a moratorium. Xcel can't shut anybody off. Once that moratorium goes away, that's we're going to need that long-term affordability perspective to be put into place. So just as an observation.
And I would love to also give the city a set of recommendations like that they could pass this summer, but then some stuff wouldn't take place until 2025 or so. Like they could pass a new buildings code to go into effect in 2025. Right. So we should think about both. But John, maybe let's prioritize just for our conversation, the existing buildings. What do you think we should put as our number one recommendation for existing buildings?
Well, I mean, my feeling is the biggest impact that we can make is to have a policy code that required energy upgrades in tandem with either more funding in the existing funding sources, like Jennifer, you were talking about with PACE and other tools, or a new funding mechanism that will allow people to immediately start doing the work. Because there's a lot of things that if you know that you're going to be required to do it within 5 years and there's funding available to do it now, you're going to be more likely to get that work completed right now.
Well, John, I would just throw up a caution because what I'm hearing from our existing building owners is that any capital investment funds they had are being diverted to paying mortgage and paying staff and keeping things open. So they're all telling me that right now those funds they had available for capital improvements like this, or even for consideration of loans, it's just not there now.
Yeah, we're hearing the same thing.
I agree. I mean, we've got, we were just about to spend $500,000 on a retrofit of a chiller system on Larimer Square, and it just literally got frozen yesterday. And that's why I think, though, that if you're providing a low-cost loan specifically for these improvements, and you know that you're going to be required to do it within a certain window, if I knew that I could pay for that chiller through a low-cost loan right now, and I knew that eventually I was going to have to do it, I probably would go ahead and do it now on Larimer Square because it's a quiet block all of a sudden. But the reason we're not doing it is because we're just paying for it. So it's just cash in our account that we're going to spend. But if I knew there was a financing mechanism that I could use for that, it might change that course.
Yeah, I strongly agree with requiring you have to upgrade. And I think we have it written on here also, a performance policy for all existing buildings. I think one of those is pretty critical to the criteria of public health, both in terms of sort of indoor air quality as well as climate.
I think, back to, something, making sure that we're back thinking, with existing buildings, keeping in mind how different so many of them are, to Kathy's point, if we've got, the larger buildings that have, incredible funds behind them to begin with, and they're still even doing that, it's the smaller buildings that have been struggling, right, achieving a lot of the goals, whether it's because of, lack of funds or not as sophisticated or all those things that we've talked about. And so I feel like that we've got to be very careful that, again, we don't group all these existing buildings right into the same pool again. Because John, to your point, it might be easy for you to get access at this stage of the game to say maybe a lower interest rate loan because of the, the high level of credit rating and things that your organization might have versus, somebody that owns a Class B or Class C building may not be able to have access to that loan at that low interest rate. And I don't know how I'm not the big finance loan guy, so I don't know how you kind of fix those things, but that's the part that I just want to make sure that we don't lose sight of that.
Well, I think that's where the opportunity is right now, because in the normal world, you would look to the banking industry and typical loan parameters for doing something like this. But just like the CARES Act and the PPP, credit worthiness was not as big of a requirement. And so you ended up getting people approved for loans that otherwise would never have been approved because the government's trying to get money out there and get people spending. And so I just think that we might be able to do something now and take advantage of that, those funds available for stimulus, to say that maybe those owners of C-class buildings or individual homes that couldn't qualify for a loan could either get a grant or some form of a stimulus loan that was low barrier for getting approved for it, but that it had to be used for some form of energy retrofits or some form of improvements that we're talking about. So I think that it's a window of time that we might be able to provide funding that otherwise we would never be able to provide.
That's a really interesting idea. That I've been thinking through what kind of access City of Denver would have to some of the stimulus funds, and it might be more directly through some of the building owners or businesses. But I think that, John, what you just outlined is an interesting way to, one of the criteria we set were being sure that we were reducing barriers to access for stimulus and prioritizing investment in disadvantaged communities, or for folks that might not otherwise have access to it. So I think that's really interesting. And taking that a step further, like one of the criteria we discussed is ensuring that this helps continue Denver on a path to a net zero economy. So we could include some sort of parameter around like energy retrofits. I don't know if the phrasing would be like with priority to all electric appliances, or like some sort of nod to electrifying might be interesting there. If this is a time when folks are getting access to loans they might not otherwise have access to.
And I think what might be helpful, and I was speaking with clients, some people are just overwhelmed as to how to even start doing it. And I think having a Zoom call that we as a task force can offer, and walking people through the step without bringing on the experts to say, these are the things that you need to do, or lessons learned, or figuring out what roadblocks people have had, so we can share that conversation so they have a place to voice this. Because I believe what happens, and I know this is true in the loan process from buying a house, they get frustrated and just don't bother. So if they have a place to talk about their frustration and have somebody walk them through and say, it's okay, this is how we do it, even if it's a webinar that they can jump into from their phone or their home, then it'll just hopefully help ease them to go through that point of frustration and actually applying for those loans. And then talking about, what do you do if you are declined from those loans? What other options do you have so they don't lose hope? And I think that's something that our task force can do in providing them some inspiration and motivation to keep moving forward through this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. A lot of these retrofits have pretty quick payback periods. So if you think about, everyone's different, but maybe some of these retrofits have a 2-year payback. From the city standpoint, that's a pretty good way to spend stimulus dollars. If they could put together $100 million fund and it was all going towards single family home energy retrofits in at-risk neighborhoods, and the city was able to garner the savings from those energy retrofits, you'd get that money back in 2-3 years. And so, the other alternative is you spend stimulus dollars that you may never see back. And so as a government, it seems to me like that's a good place to put money, because you would be able to get a payback.
Should we spend a minute talking about new stuff? Jasmine, can you scroll over to the new homes?
Yeah.
New buildings and new homes.
Mm-hmm. Right here.
One of the things, while Jessica's looking at that, the education and training piece, I think, is another key area that, if we think about it, I know when you think about existing buildings, there are tons of opportunity. Building engineers are in critical need. So I think that, while the training piece of it, might take a little bit longer, but is there a way to get some folks that have been affected, by this with their jobs, working through programs and using even some of that stimulus money to look at what are the positions that are, because all those building engineers, right, they've been at the buildings all through this. They've been essential workers, right, through this whole thing, because the buildings can't just shut down, right, while they've, so that's another piece I think we shouldn't probably lose sight of. And John, since you're our fearless leader, I heard about this. There's a thing called COVID-19 Finance Assistance Network, and they're doing pro bono finance assistance. So they'll work with businesses and stuff on all kinds of things around, looking to the future and doing strategic thinking and all that kind of thing. So I just throw that out there, as I heard it on one of the calls I was on this week. So might be worth putting that in the notes for people to be aware that there is somebody out there to help look at, if these kind of funds, they're helping people work through some of these CARES Act loans right now and some of the other things. So
it's called COVID-19 Finance Assistance Network.
I think it's important too to layer on that we have, you know, Excel has still demand side management programs out there for new construction and existing, so we need to layer those on too. And thinking about as that new filing comes up, you know, what the city can do to help, you know, whatever comes through, that those are layered on. I mean, we just have to keep layering as many of these capital.
And right now I'm actually on a conference call.
Yeah, Jennifer, I think that's a really critical thing, that we're not recreating programs that already exist. So trying to find existing programs and leaning on those to implement these ideas.
Well, it sounds like what we really need are like navigators to keep, you know, like depending on where people are in the process, some people may have energy managers, some people may not even have considered that. I think one of the things we've been talking about from a portfolio perspective with some of the building owners we work with, that they really need to hire an energy manager because it's going to be an important thing for them to think about in the future. And so this may stimulate that. So, you know, really having the city be the incubator for, because the problem with all of these is that you can't kind of, give one company a benefit over another, right? So you have to kind of create this even opportunity to say, here's all the programs, here's how you navigate it. And then people that are interested in participating can do that. Because you're absolutely right. Everything's, well, at least from our contractors that do energy modeling and stuff, they're on hold because they can't get into buildings. So it's going to be this balance of the work in buildings is challenging if you can't get in the building. We've been doing virtual assessments, which has been working amazingly well, and we're still bidding out projects. And so I think, again, thinking about what that new software is going to look like, how do we set up new protocols and best practices in the city is really the best to kind of drive that. And I think the recommendation could be to really have, you know, build this sort of navigator platform for both new buildings and existing buildings to take advantage of, you know, all the programs, and then to really prioritize all these things that we've laid out in this Trello. Some it's going to be code, some of it's going to be, you know, taking advantage of just the benchmarking program that we already have in place, and maybe adding a little bit of more structure around that, so that you're not mandating things which can add a lot of cost to people, but instead you're, you know, suggesting things that are going to have incentives tied to them.
I think we should also add some things around water, like someone was mentioning earlier. I just looking through the Trello board, we have a lot of electrifying and better air quality, but we don't have anything around water. And I'm not exactly sure where this would fit in, but wastewater. So the Littleton Inglewood wastewater treatment facility invested with, I think it was with Excel, to have, instead of burning their methane, they were able to put it back on the grid, and they're getting back a lot of money for that. And I know the larger, I think it's like Denver Metro Wastewater, is also looking into doing something similar like that. So that could be also a way of getting to our goal, but you know, I guess it's at a larger scale, and these companies can get some money back.
That's a really, really good point, Jasmine. And I'll just give an example. We did a multifamily affordable housing. It was like 100 units, and we did all the energy efficiency work, but we replaced the toilets and the outdoor water, and they're financing the savings from the water savings. I mean, the water savings were so substantial, like 75%, that it actually accelerated. You know, we were able to provide most of it through a grant, but there was some, you know, owner contribution that it was paid back, I think, within less than 2 years. I think that's a really, really good point, and we don't often layer those on. But the water savings can be substantial with some of these other efficiency measures.
Yeah, so maybe we can have like a whole building retrofit packet that includes water and electricity. And maybe, and like some air quality stuff too. So maybe like some filters or something.
But also that's the recycling piece that you've been wanting too.
Mm-hmm.
One of the big challenges with any of these is, how do you get these programs out there? How do you tell people? And particularly with existing homes, because people aren't going to be, you know, necessarily hearing about this. And so, you know, trying to think of, is there a way that you can get companies to go out and go door to door and tell people about these programs, or there's, I think, a big gap between just setting up a program and then making sure that people know about it. So does anybody have any ideas on how we could have some sort of communication plan so we can get out there and let people know what these programs are?
Some options, and it may be challenging in other neighborhoods that don't have this communication options, but the newsletters, most neighborhoods between Nextdoor, Facebook neighborhood websites have educational pieces that they stick in there. So between them, and then also the neighborhood groups, obviously, that we can get in touch with that can disseminate that information. And then I would say, honestly, the realtors who are doing marketing, they're doing a lot of door-to-door right now, and getting them to push out that information by doing some partnerships or joint ventures so that that information is being a resource instead of them sending out the football schedule or recipes, but using that as an educational piece to reach their neighborhoods that they farm.
I just want to warn, in the vulnerable neighborhood issues, that we see a lot of predatory lending around this stuff.
Yeah,
so we have to be really careful. So I think if we're targeting certain neighborhoods, there needs to be a real, again, this gets back to, while I appreciate that we need to target certain industries and there's certain, folks that we can work with, that neighborhood approach where you have neighbors telling neighbors, people see the work being done, is really, really valuable. So to the extent that as this task force starts to prioritize where they want this work being done, we just have to be really careful of that messaging in vulnerable communities.
Great point.
Especially
so we have a minute and a half left before we get pushed into the big group. So we talked about prioritizing policies that are focused on getting people back to work, and specifically looking at existing buildings because we think that can get people to work the quickest. We also talked about water savings and looking more holistically rather than just at electrification. We talked about the need of financing mechanisms to be tied with policies, and looking both at existing mechanisms as well as new mechanisms. And we also talked about how those financing mechanisms really have to be built around equity, so that that more people can qualify, and that there's not as much red tape, and that people can get qualified, get the funds necessary to get these retrofits done quickly. Is there anything?
Just one thing to add on the existing buildings. I really liked how you put it, of requiring energy upgrades, requiring specific energy upgrades, and thinking about the financing for those. So I think we want to send a strong package of recommendations, and I think that needs to be in there.
Yep.
And just add consumer protections in there too.
Yep.
And is it worth, John, correct me if you've touched on this, but I know that most of our recommendations are focused on like specific